Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Emily Norton, and I'm the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association. I'll be one of tonight's speakers, and I will introduce the other two. First, some housekeeping. I don't have to tell you where the exits or the bathrooms are. They are where they have always been, in your home, so that should be easy. This is the third event in our virtual series, so we are getting the hang of it, but please have patience with us if anything glitches. Before we get started, I want to note an upcoming event you may also be interested in. On May 14th, a week from tonight, our aquatic scientist Lisa Kumpf is moderating a discussion on dam removal on the Charles. That should be really interesting. It's exciting to think about restoring rivers that have been dammed for decades or even centuries. So tonight, on to tonight's event. We are excited to have nearly 80 RSVPs. We are also streaming on Facebook Live, and our previous events have had quite a few viewers there. I also have a request. I'd love to know what city or town you are from. So please just type that into the Q&A. It will be helpful for us to skim through those and see who is here tonight. And with that, I will introduce our speakers. The Reverend Vernon K. Walker is a program manager at CRWA, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather, which is a network of local leaders building grassroots climate resilience through inclusive and hands-on education, service, and planning. Reverend Walker is originally from Philadelphia. He has a Bachelor in Science in Organizational Leadership from Penn State University and a master's degree in Theological Studies from Boston University. Reverend Walker is a fellow at the Environmental Leadership Program and serves on the boards of Massachusetts Peace Action, Earth Day 2020, the Massachusetts Sierra Club, Voter Choice for Massachusetts, and Interfaith Worker Justice. Our other speaker besides me is my colleague, Julie Wood. Julie is the Deputy Director of CRWA and has held numerous positions at CRWA since first joining in 2007. Prior to CRWA, Julie was an AmeriCorps volunteer at the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and a program educator for the New England Aquarium. Julie lives in Somerville, where she serves on the city's Commission on Energy Use and Climate Change. She has a BA in mathematics from Boston College and an MS in environmental science from UMass Boston. And with that, we will turn it over to Reverend Walker.
All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Emily. I am so glad to be with you all who are on the call tonight, who have taken some time out of your busy day to engage with us around climate resiliency and to engage with us around the impacts of climate change. And I won't be before you long. I just really want to just go through some things about what we do at CRWA, who we are, why we exist, etc. So let us delve right into it. And if you have any questions, please do save your questions at the end. We'll certainly be glad to address those in the fashion that they come in. So at any rate, CRWA is a program that the CRWA is an acronym for Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. We are part of the Better Future Project. And I will read what the mission of the Better Future Project is. I'm sure you can see it on your screen. The Better Future Project works to build a powerful grassroots movement to address the climate crisis and advance a rapid and responsible transition beyond coal, oil, and gas towards renewable future for all. There are 3 programs that are a part of the Better Future Project. There is 350 Mass, which some of you may be familiar with already. There is Divest Ed, which is actually a national program, and folks work with college students to put pressure on their college administrations to divest pensions from fossil fuel companies. And then there's CRWA. You may be wondering, well, what is CRWA? What do we do at the CRWA? Well, I'm really so glad you asked on tonight. CRWA is a young grassroots organization that aims to build equitable and inclusive neighborhood climate resilience in New England through hands-on education, service, and planning. Just for the record, we've been around for about almost 2 years. This is the newest program of the Better Future Project. I've had the privilege of being with CRWA for about a year now, or almost a year. And essentially that is our model. We're looking to build equitable, sustainable, inclusive neighborhood climate resilience in New England. So let us jump into the next slide and let us talk a little bit about what are climate impacts. So essentially, New England is faced with a few different types of climate impacts. The first one I want to start with is heat. We know that heat, it gets pretty hot in the summertime here. So what we see is we have a map in front of us that you are seeing on my screen share. And this map is very pivotal in understanding where we are and how we understand heat waves, past, present, and future. So if you'll go with me to 1971 to 2000, you'll see that there were about 10 days of 90 degree of days where temperature was 90 degrees. And there was one day when it was over 100 degrees. And then if you'll go with me to the middle, you'll see to 2015 to 2044 timeframe. And these things are predicted, the science is predicting this, that you could see that there's a jump. It goes from 10 days of the temperature over 90 degrees to 29 days. And it goes to 2 days over 100. So we must understand, and then I'll get into the last slide or last calendar chart in just a second. But I want to emphasize and highlight that we understand that heat waves are very detrimental to elderly, to those with health conditions, and little children. So we understand that when there is excessive heat waves, such as we are predicted to have, it is it can be very disastrous for the three categories that I mentioned, let alone also low income and low wealth communities. If I could take your mind back just for a second, in 1995, there was a massive heat wave. There was a deep heat wave, and unfortunately, about 739 people died in this heat wave. And the heat wave, it was about a week, and so hundreds of people died. There's a book out called Heat Wave, the 1995 social autopsy. The 1995, the social autopsy of the 1995 heat wave. The author Eric Klingenberg. It's a very good book. He does an analysis. He's a sociologist. So he goes block by block, and he does an analysis to see what is the greatest predictability of survivability. What is the greatest indication of survivability? And what the research says, according to his research, is that it's not necessarily where you lived or what kind of car you drove or how much money you had in the bank. It was essentially about, do you have social capital? Are you connected to your neighbors? And the reason that 739 heat waves did not turn heat wave related deaths did not balloon to 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 is because some of the vulnerable in the community had friends that were checking in on them, had neighbors that were checking on them, had loved ones that were checking on them, etc. So we understand that heat waves are disastrous. There was also a massive heat wave in Europe in 2003, and 70,000 people died. So there is dire consequences that come as a result of heat waves. So now let's go to the last chart here, 2055 to 2084, which seems like a long time away, folks. But you can see that there are over 30 days of 90-degree weather, and we must understand and recognize there's only about 90 days of summer, 91 days of summer from June through August. So between the time frame of 2055 and 2084, a majority of these days will be excessively hot. which will prove to be disastrous for the most vulnerable in our community. So that is one. So now I want to go to more precipitation, more rain and snow. So what we saw between 1958 and 2016 is that Boston, the greater Boston area, saw an increase in the biggest storm, biggest winter and spring storm. That is because warm air holds more moisture. So when it does rain or snow, those events will be stronger. In the last 50 years, we've seen an amount of water that drops in the very strongest storms, the 1%, biggest storms each year, go up by 55%. So we understand that because of the extreme weather that's already present and that will be coming, we're going to see the intensity, the rain and the snow and the heat and the floods become greater. So we must understand also that Hurricane Duran, which was a hurricane that devastated New Orleans, the Bahamas last year, 2019, that is a result of climate change. That's another example of extreme weather. Or Hurricane Katrina that devastated New Orleans in 2005 and literally destroyed people's lives and homes. That is an example of climate change. That's an example of extreme weather. That's an example of a result because of climate change. So shall I go on? I'm glad you suggested that. So now what we're talking about is stormwater flooding. So we can see this is the Cambridge area near Kendall, MIT. You see right there, and all that purple stuff represents stormwater flooding. So this is by 2070. So we see that most of the area in Kendall, MIT will be flooded because of stormwater, and stormwater comes as a result of the rain, which we have demonstrated, which will be more increased because of extreme weather. So now let's go to coastal flooding. So we understand that because of these coastal flooding, coastal flooding comes as a result of sea level rise. So go with me, if you will, and let's examine this map. So I'm going to just point my mouse here, and you see that these areas are blue. They're lightly blue. This is about 2030. You can see just a little bit of blue. These are communities that will be under water to an extent. So watch this. So what we see is by 2050, y'all, that there is a greater intensity of this thing now. This thing is becoming more widespread and it's becoming more pervasive. It's becoming more prominent throughout the city because we see that there is more blue areas. There is more community that will be underwater. Now, someone asked the question, well, what will it look like in 2070? Because someone said to themselves, wow, that looks like what will happen in 2030. And wow, that looks like what will happen, what could possibly happen in 2050. Now, watch this. In 2070, we can see that there's a greater intensity of these flooded areas. And what we understand is that certain communities in Boston will be underwater. The parts of Dorchester, the South End, South Boston, Back Bay. It gives me no pleasure in saying this, but the reality of it is, folks, that if we do not begin to prepare now, then we will be caught off guard. If we do not begin to understand the consequences of extreme weather that's here and that will get greater as we go along, then sometimes we can get caught off guard. And in fact, sometimes I'm grabbing a quote from somebody. Someone said that they never, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. I think it was Mike Tyson. Now, I'm not saying Mike Tyson is a role model now. I don't want you running around saying I said that. But what I'm saying is that Tyson had a point. Tyson said that everybody's got a plan until chaos comes. Everybody's got a plan until turmoil comes. Everybody's got a plan until the unexpected comes. So what we are simply in the business of doing, and what we're simply in the business of trying trying to do is to help prepare people for this extreme weather, because yes, it's coming, but you don't have to be hopeless, and you don't have to subscribe to a certain level of defeatism, because if I believe that when we get together, and when neighbors come together, and when neighbors stick together, that yes, the extreme weather will come, the wind will blow, and the rains will descend, and the flood will come, but when we are prepared, and when we are connected up, then we can begin to adequately and sustainably prepare for what's coming. If I was in church, I'd say, look at your neighbor and say, be prepared. But don't worry, you ain't got to do that now, because I know people in their different homes and things of that nature. So you don't have to look at your neighbor and say, be prepared. But any rate, so now I want to go to hurricanes. So I really want to talk about hurricanes for a second, because I know some people here in New England, and I just want to be clear, folks, that these climate impacts are specifically for the New England region. So I'm not necessarily dealing with the whole United States as a whole, because we understand and recognize that in different parts of the country, there are more, both cities have more vulnerability to certain types of weather. So we understand that hurricane is real. And actually, I want to read this for you about hurricane surge projection. So Hurricane Sandy, some of us remember that. Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey at a high tide as a Category 3 storm, which caused a peak of 14-foot storm surge. Here in Massachusetts, we only got 2 to 5 feet, and we got really lucky, y'all. But if the thing would have hit us 4 hours earlier, then we would have experienced consequential flooding that those who experienced, the folks that what New York and New Jersey experienced. So let me jump on down here. So there are also some psychological attacks, and I won't be with you long. I just want to point out a few things that I'm going to get out your way. But I just want to talk about the psychological effects of climate change and extreme weather. And I want you all to just look at this with me. And this is according to the American Public Health Association, the American Psychological Association. So we understand that using Hurricane Katrina as an example, we see that 54% of adults and 45% of children suffered depression after a natural disaster. In fact, we also saw that there was 49% of Hurricane Katrina survivors developed anxiety or mood disorder, and 1 out of 6 individuals developed PSTD, and suicide and suicidal ideation more than double. So we understand that there is a psychological component to having lived through living in a devastated community because of extreme weather. But and then we understand that outside of the United States, that suicides of 60,000 Indian farmers over the last 3 decades have been directly linked to climate change. Yes. So we understand that an increase of 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit on any given day was linked to 335 deaths. Oh, it's really outstanding. And it's just flabbergasted. It's just really mind-boggling and perplexing to understand the damages that a community, that an individual experiences because having their whole life messed up by a hurricane, or messed up by a flood, or messed up by excessive heat, or messed up by coastal flooding, or messed up by sea level rise, or messed up by increased precipitation in the air, rain and snow. So it's very interesting. But I want to really share something with you here, and then I'll let you know about what we do with all this, and then I'll get out your way. So the crumbling community effect. So we understand that the crumbling community effect, and I want to read here. After a climate event or resulting displacement, people may experience a diminished sense of self, difficulty relating to others, diminished social interaction, and sociologia, the loss of sense of place, solace, and security tied to one's physical environment. Community impacts include domestic violence, domestic abuse, child abuse, violence, assault and civil conflict, economical insecurity, and physical damage, and are some of the other potential effects. But cooperation is key. Being connected to one another in our community is key. And I'll explain how we do that in just a second through the crew lens and through the crew model. So cooperation simply suggests that it establishes social ties and connections with community members. This will help to withstand challenges and encourage adaptation. So what does crew do about this? And I'm almost done, and I'm almost out your way. But what we do about all this is we, theoretically, we are preparing people conceptually for what's coming and what's already here. But pragmatically, we do a few different things. So I'd like to show you. We have what's called community teams. So we have crew teams. These crew teams are developed in a local neighborhood in a given city or town. And the purpose of these crew teams, the purpose of these crew teams is to develop and create social ties in the community of residents among each other. And the purpose of having these ties is so that when the storms do come and the wind blow and the floods rise up, that the most vulnerable in our community are looked after. So we have a team in Cambridge and Somerville. We have some other possible team or individuals across the state who are interested in starting one in their city or town, but hasn't formally gotten off the ground yet. But I would love to talk with you more if you're interested in starting a crew team or getting more into the weeds of what a crew team is. Be happy to talk to you. And what you see here is you see someone with a sledgehammer. This is what's called depaving. In depaving, this is an event. Depaving is a process where you break up concrete. Because how many of y'all heard about urban heat island effects? So in like urban communities, inner cities, you have the heat island effects, and these things, and these heat island effects simply is the lack of trees in a given community. Now we understand that when there are a lack of trees in a given community, concrete makes the community feel sometimes 6 to 10 degrees hotter because there's no tree. So trees certainly do have benefit. However, if you break up the concrete, now I'm not advocating you going tonight or tomorrow or any day to get a sledgehammer and break up the concrete in your community without proper consent or permission from the local authorities. I'm not suggesting that, but the paving that we have done, this is one from Somerville, is for people's private properties, and they give like a driveway, for example, and they've given the consent for us to come with sledgehammers and to come with the necessary equipment. Obviously, this is before the coronavirus. We had the hammers and the necessary equipment to break up some concrete, because if you turn it into green space, then now that can help aid the environment by pulling toxins out of the air or carbon out of the air because there's more green space. Or if you even use brick, brick is more healthier for a community because the rain can get absorbed in the soil, where when there's concrete, the rain cannot get through because there's cement and concrete. So that's one method. So we talked about crew teams, and that's an example of an activity that we do. And I just want to be clear that if you are interested in signing up for a crew team, you don't necessarily have to take a sledgehammer and swing it. That's not a necessary requirement to be considered a crew team. That's just an example of an activity of what a crew team did. So then we have resiliency hubs. So resiliency hubs are local trusted organizations in the community that agree to open their doors to be a warming center, or to be a warming center in the wintertime, a cooling center in the springtime, to be a charging center for like batteries, and essentially what it takes to be a crew hub. And if you know an organization in your community, or if you would like to learn more about it, I can get into it because I'm limited on time here. But essentially, what a Universal and Crew Resiliency Hub are organizations that will display a climate resiliency hub window decal, which Crew we will give. We make emergency preparedness kits, which also Crew provide. Which emergency preparedness kit is a book bag where there are certain items in it, and I'll show you one picture of it, that can increase the survivability during a flood. And we ask that organizations at the very minimum hold an event that's yearly related to climate preparedness. And then we also do have a climate prep week. Last year we had 128 events in Massachusetts, and we had 6 across the country. Climate prep week happened at the end of September 24th to 30th, and it really did exempt, and this again is a decal taken from Climate Prep Week 2019. And essentially this is these events, all these different events, a lot were held at libraries, a lot of them were held at, various ones were held at like faith communities, etc. The purpose is to educate the local community constituency about climate resiliency and how to prepare for climate change or the extreme weather that comes because of climate change. And again, folks, and I just want to take one more minute. Well, again, folks, our purpose is to prepare people for this extreme weather that is coming. And we will have a climate prep week in 2020 this year. In all likelihood, it'll be a virtual event. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can email me. Please feel free to email me, vernon@climatecrew.org. And again, I think we could probably provide my email in the chat or something. And essentially, this is an example of a kit. So you can imagine all this stuff in a book bag, like choose the foods you will eat. And this is just like a slide, like ready to eat canned meat, fruits, vegetables, canned open protein or fruit bar, dry cereal, granola, peanut butter, maybe have a medicine kit. And essentially the purpose of all this, is that imagine if there's a flood in your house and it may be a while before 911 gets to you, you want to make, and all the power is out in your house and you can't plug up anything. You want to have like a poncho. You want to have these things that help make sure that you're good until the rescue squad, at least for a couple of days, until the rescue squad gets there. But that's the end of my time. I want to put a pin right there, and I want to thank you for allowing me to share a little bit about CREW. I'll be around for a while, and I think we're going to transition to the next portion of this program. And Emily, please feel free to take it away, and I'm going to get out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Reverend Walker. That was terrific and a great teeing up for the CRWA piece of this that Julie and I are going to tag team on. So I will now, let's see, want to start by defining our terms. A lot of folks following this may be familiar with that there's kind of 2 sides of the climate change discussion: mitigation, where we're trying to prevent greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're in a boat that's leaking, this would be the trying to prevent the cause, fix the leak in the boat. Or what we're going to be talking about, resilience, which used to be adaptation, which is really protecting against the weather extremes. So the weather extremes that we know are coming, that Reverend Walker laid out so eloquently. So that would be bailing out the boat. You need both, right? And I thought this quote was helpful, if kind of a downer. When we excavate the remains of past civilizations, we very rarely find any evidence that they, as a whole society, made any attempts to change in the face of a drying climate, a warming atmosphere, or other changes. I view this inflexibility as the real reason for collapse. That's a local archaeologist. So the stakes are very high for the topic that we're going to be talking about tonight. So first, just some background on me that is relevant. In addition to being the ED of CRWA, I serve as a city councilor in Newton, my hometown, and I've been an elected official there since 2013, and I have done some cool green things. And before being at CRWA, I was at the Sierra Club as the Massachusetts director. And in that role, I did a lot in terms of training local activists. So training local elected officials, training activists in the area of clean energy in particular. And something that I realized when I got to CRWA was that in the clean energy world, several years ago, folks who really cared about the environment might have been like, wow, we need to recycle more, we need to plant more trees. They weren't so up on the lingo and the jargon of the clean energy things that we need: building codes, solar net metering, municipal aggregation. And now a lot of climate activists really understand those things. When it comes, and they know to ask for them and to advocate for them. But when it comes to climate resilience, and this is just sort of a joke slide. I tried to imagine, like, there was some rally in front of the State House, what would the climate resilience folks be saying? What do we want? Stormwater utilities, when do we want them? Now. There really isn't the rallying cry around resilience. So that's what we're hoping with this presentation, is to offer some ideas on that. And then just an observation, it's so interesting in these times as we are sharing this presentation remotely at the social distancing, we're hiding out in the era of coronavirus. There's some parallels with climate change. There's, when it comes to policymakers, that is, there's a focus on short-term decision-making rather than long-term. In fact, I can speak to this another time. If folks are interested on the barriers to long-term decision-making, you don't really get rewarded for that. In general, science and complexity are barriers to good decision-making from policymakers, and we have that both. That's why we put this article from about COVID, but that's also true for climate change. That's what the photos are supposed to show, that some of this stuff is complicated and boring. The worst impacts of each are felt by the powerless. We also have vested corporate interests, arguably at odds with the public good, with both COVID and climate change. And also natural spaces are our salvation with both of those. And we will be talking a bit about that. So just very brief background on CRWA, if folks aren't familiar, we were founded in 1965 by local folks really disgusted by the state of the Charles River. We have been an integral part of the cleanup of the river, and we actually had a presentation last week by the former ED, Bob Zimmerman. So if you haven't seen that, I would definitely check it out on our website. It's a great story. Our mission remains protecting, preserving, and enhancing the Charles River and its watershed lands through science, advocacy, and the law. Just some background. This is what the river looked like 50 years ago. And here's just a view. It's much cleaner today. And so the story of CRWA is very inspirational, I think, in terms of the things that we can do when we put our minds to it. Why are we even talking about climate resilience, though? So as we're going to talk about, many of the things that CRWA has already been advocating for in order to improve water quality in the Charles River further, because the job is not done at all, are also the same things that will help build climate resilience. And nature has a lot of those solutions. So just some background very quickly. Charles River Watershed starts just like, I'll make you guess, just like what else starts in Hopkinton? You can shout that out at home. Yes, the Boston Marathon. The Charles River also starts in Hopkinton, and it winds its way. It's very wavy on its way to Boston through 35 towns, through 23 towns, but the watershed has 35. Basically, a watershed is where rain falls. What waterway it ends up in is the Charles. And wherever you are, I was scanning earlier where the folks are who are listening right now. And as far as way as California, I cannot tell you what watershed you are in, but you are in a watershed. There are 28 watersheds in Massachusetts. So whoever is watching, who's from Massachusetts, you are in a watershed. And just some interesting background. When we're all in person, I make people shout this out, but I'll give it away. If you look at some of the names of communities in Massachusetts, what do they all have in common? A lot of them have water in common. So when early Europeans got to these lands, they were very watery. We have significantly changed the land. And so they gave them names that had to do with water. We have changed the land in order to be able to have modern lives, buildings, roads, parking lots, tennis courts, etc. And this is this is a map from Newton of historical water bodies, and a lot of them have buildings and have been covered over. And this is one of the things we've done is this photo on the right is we have culverted our rivers and streams. This is Cheesecake Brook, and much of it is actually completely covered over. This part is open, but as you can see, channelized. So we have essentially conquered the natural waterways that were originally here. And the impact of that is pretty dire for the future, which is what we're talking about right now. So if folks may be familiar with the National Climate Assessment, which came out a couple of years ago, and the predictions, as Reverend Walker pointed out, heat, precipitation. They also predict evacuated and displaced populations related to storms. And they say that all of it is exacerbated by our aging infrastructure, which we'll be talking about. And again, as he pointed out, the climate disasters and climate impacts are felt disproportionately. by low income and the elderly, and with COVID as well. If you are salaried, you're okay, more or less. If you are only paid if you show up at your job and you can't get there, you are hurt disproportionately. Low income are more likely to live in flood areas, live in areas that are industrial, that'll have pollution that is spread in a storm. In so many ways are more vulnerable. This is actually, we didn't plan this ahead of time, but Reverend Walker actually spoke about the Chicago heat wave, where most of the victims, as they say in 1995, were the elderly poor. So that's what this is about. Just want to dig into exactly why impermeable surface and a built environment matters. So here's going to lay out just some examples. So on the basic level, water that would have soaked into the ground doesn't anymore. It goes into the storm drains. When you have old infrastructure, they leak, you have flooding. Even new storm drains are not built for the volume. He showed you that, that map showing the increase in precipitation that is already here and is coming. Even new storm drains are not built for the amount of rain that we are already seeing and are going to be seeing even more in the future. Built environment means fewer trees. Trees hold in water. Our summers are getting hotter, and it's a really, really big difference. The difference at night between natural cover and impermeable surface, such as asphalt, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, when I was a kid growing up in Newton, virtually no one in this area had air conditioning. You didn't need it. Well, there's more vulnerability there because many people still don't have air conditioning, so they're not ready for these hot summers. Even if you have it and power goes out in a storm, you are vulnerable. So this is a difference of life and death that all of us need to be thinking about and planning for. And the water, buried streams are still streams, and the water still goes there. And at this, I'm gonna turn it over to Julie, and we just practiced.
Okay.
Yes.
Looks like it worked. Excellent. Yes. Excellent, great. All right, thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the impacts of our urban life and what they've done to our natural life. And then we'll get quickly into solutions, which I think is really why many of you are here. So the impacts to develop watershed are made pretty clear in these two little drawings here. If you see in the natural area, about 50% of the rain that falls is going to get down into the ground. And then the other 50%, 40% of that is going to become runoff. Versus the, all right, I'll talk quickly because these, seem like they're on autoplay. And then 40% gets taken up by vegetation and put into the atmosphere. We have drastically changed those ratios in our developed area. Where we have a lot of impervious cover, now we have only about 15% of the rainwater that falls getting into the ground. 30% gets taken up by plants because we have less of them, and 55% becomes stormwater runoff. So that's a huge increase in stormwater runoff versus what would have gone down into the ground. Next slide. And we have drastically changed our landscape. This is an 1890s map. I think most people are probably familiar with this area, even if you don't know. But if you switch next, Emily, you will see down at the bottom of your screen the airport, Logan Airport appear where water once was.
Yeah, I'm going to go back and do that again because it's so cool. So here's before, here's after. Okay, I'll stop now.
So we have filled in wetlands. We have filled in what was open water. And we have disconnected streams that were once connected. Once part of the same hydrologic system, we've now separated them to build our airports and our Suffolk Downs and all the other infrastructure that we rely on for our modern life. And so stormwater runoff pollution, it isn't necessarily something you can see, but you can certainly see the impacts of it. And I'm guessing this is something these are things most of you has observed, whether you knew it or not. Litter is a pretty obvious and visible one. So obviously any litter that we put out on our streets and sidewalks get washed washes down into the river or the banks of the river when it rains. And we have those, you know, huge trash piles that you'll sometimes see in corners of the river. And then other impacts that people can see are invasive plants. They can grow out of control in the river, make it hard for people to canoe and kayak through. We get a lot of calls in the summertime from rowers who are just getting their oars completely tangled up because the invasive plants have just taken over. And then the picture on the bottom where the water looks like it had a paint spill, that is actually cyanobacteria, which is an issue we have in the Charles and an issue a lot of freshwater bodies have around the country. Those cyanobacteria can actually produce toxins that can be directly harmful to human health. They come in the summertime when the water is hot, and they are fed by nutrient pollution. And so unfortunately, that's one impact we do expect to get worse from climate change if we don't really work to address it. Next slide. So both Emily and Reverend Walker talked about impervious cover. So obviously it's not only an issue because of the temperature and heat impacts, it's a significant issue for water bodies. General rule of thumb, for a watershed that has over 10% impervious cover, you're going to see pretty severe impacts. This is by town in our watershed. Each of these red lines is a town. So we do have quite a range, you know, down from about 6% in Sherburne up to Somerville's over 70%. We do have quite a range, but the vast majority of the communities in our watershed are fairly developed and over 10% impervious. So that is a challenge. But now we wanted to get into solutions. So what can we do about this? Well, one of the ways we like to think about it at Charles River Watershed Association is that nature actually already has a lot of the answers. So when you think that, if you think back to that image I had where about 50% of the water was going into the ground in a natural system, that system works pretty well. The water gets cleaned, the water gets stored, so it can be useful in a drought situation, and the plants hold water as well. So a lot of the solutions that we can look to in our urban environment actually come directly from what's going on in nature. So using soil and plants to filter water, using the ground to store water so it doesn't become polluted runoff or a flooding issue, and then also using plants and natural ground cover to cool our areas and reduce the impacts of urban heat island. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. We're not talking about, although I loved the slide of the crew team ripping up the pavement, that was awesome. But we know that has some limited application. So we're not talking about ripping up all the pavement and taking down all the business buildings and turning this back into a forest. We're talking about taking those techniques and putting them into smaller, well-designed systems that we can integrate into our urban landscape. So that's basically what these pictures are that you see here. And they can look very, very attractive. All these ones are very nice looking. Right along a sidewalk, it can be a very small green infrastructure system, takes in the runoff, slows it down, cools it down, filters out the pollutants, and ideally gets it back into the ground. The one on the bottom left shows a nice little aquatic feature. It looks like that's right in a residential area too. So they can also add a lot of aesthetic value. And cities are doing this. Hopefully some of you are from communities that know that your city is doing this. Cities and towns across the state and across the country are doing this. This is an example of a study where Cambridge was looking at green infrastructure to reduce urban heat island modeling. So whereas to reduce urban heat island impacts. So where their driver perhaps primarily was to reduce urban heat island, they also get a whole bunch of flood benefits that go along with installing those green infrastructure systems. So let's talk about what we all can do. Maybe not everybody's going to you know, go out and start a new career at a watershed association, and you don't need to. You really don't need to. You don't need to be a professional at all to make a difference. And this is a point Emily will speak more eloquently on than me because of her leadership role in her local government. But we wanted to basically give some tips for folks tonight for how you can take the next step, what you can do in your own community to make sure your community is preparing for climate change and ideally using nature-based solutions as much as possible. So one really important thing to do is to protect what we have. Not develop in areas where we know are going to be risky, like floodplains, not fill in our wetlands, and not cut down our trees. That is the lowest hanging fruit, as they say, but nevertheless, it does still seem to be a challenge. And so just pushing those natural resources as assets, making your community leaders understand how important they are and what role they are playing. I mean, basically, they're another piece of city infrastructure, a piece of city or town infrastructure that is helping you adapt to climate change. And you already have it, so you don't have to pay to invest it. We are building at CRWA what we call our climate resilience toolkit, all sorts of different policy actions or on-the-ground restoration opportunities that we can offer to our community partners, our municipal partners, and our watershed residents to help move those forward in their communities, to help everybody be more prepared for the changes we know are coming. So land conservation, basically in the theme of protecting what we already have. Land conservation, strengthening your wetlands protections, strengthening protections for trees, really maximizing your stormwater management, open space plans, some zoning opportunities as well, having overlay districts, and then restoration opportunities. I'll talk a little bit more about those as we go. And then of course, paying for it and funding this, that's always key. So that's why at Emily's fake rally at the State House, everyone is going to cheer for stormwater utilities or stormwater fees. And I'll talk about more of those at a coming slide. So always good to start off with a success story. So MBS is nature-based solutions. We have one of the biggest nature-based success stories in the entire country in something called the Natural Valley Storage Area. So after some severe flooding in the mid-50s in the area, the Army Corps came in and was basically looking at a plan for what they could do to address the flooding. And so they had their very traditional canals, levees, hardscape typed design plan. And it was actually one of CRWA's very early executive directors, a woman named Rita Barron, who pushed very strongly for a different approach. She pushed for preserving and conserving wetlands. She recognized that wetlands are basically nature's sponge, that they can help hold and preserve water. They also clean it. They also offer wonderful habitat. And so through her dogged advocacy, we now have the Natural Valley Storage Area. I think on the next slide, we have some photos. This is over 8,000 acres of wetlands. It's not a contiguous wetland. It's pockets of wetlands that are conserved across 16 different communities. And so these were bought up or rights purchased between the late 1970s and the early 1980s at a cost of $8.3 million, a lot less expensive than investing in building, large hardscape flood infrastructure. And these have proven to really show their worth. They protect Boston and the other developed downstream communities from large flood events today. We see in the Charles River, we see the sort of the peak of the storm. I guess everybody's talking about flattening the curve. For coronavirus, well, the natural valley storage area flattens the curve for rainstorms in the Charles River. It's basically exactly the same thing. So it really slows the water so that all the water doesn't arrive at the same time and overwhelm our system. And then another opportunity that this story could really be a whole webinar, and we did at one time do a whole webinar on it. So I'll just talk briefly. Widett Circle, if people aren't familiar with it, it's along 93 South. In Boston, and every few years a new big splashy plan for it comes up. It was the Olympics, or I think actually before that it was Robert Kraft's soccer stadium, and so there's been a lot of different plans for this area. And so CRWA took a look at this, and one of the interesting things about it is that it is one of the first major pathways for coastal flooding. It's one of the first major areas where coastal flooding could potentially get into the rest of the city. And it also is the end of 2 buried streams. And then much of it used to be what was called South Bay, an actual bay. So that has all been paved over, and now we just have this large expanse of pavement. The city was looking to sell it to a private development a few years back. CRWA investigated it. We suggested, why not put a large wetland there? A large wetland could protect an area about 3 times the size of it, and that way people upstream would be protected from flooding. And here's just an image we created of if you did daylight some of those historic streams that go through there. Obviously, you get the amenity of the stream as well as the flood benefits and the water quality benefits. Dam removal. And so dams powered an economy that no longer exists. And right now, many of them are just ticking time bombs. And this has become all the more urgent with those extreme rain events that Reverend Walker mentioned. And so when you get a huge load of water coming down the river, perhaps in the volumes that these dams have never seen, these dams are old, you do risk having a dam failure. And obviously that can be catastrophic to all of the infrastructure and the residents that live downstream. So we've been working with a lot of our communities to investigate and think about taking these out. Obviously, that has a lot of ecological benefits as well as providing some safety benefits in the face of climate change. I think I'm handing it back over to you now, Emily.
Yes, okay, thank you so much, Julie. So at this point, want to just think about our target audience. In Massachusetts, and maybe elsewhere, but we're focused on Massachusetts, your local officials, appointed and elected, actually have a lot of say over these sort of decisions because it's land use, it's development, it's zoning. So you think about who's in charge of that. It's city councilors, select boards, planning boards, zoning boards, conservation commissions. A lot of local officials actually have a tremendous amount of authority about these decisions. But that's also a limitation. Your local electeds, speaking personally, your city councilors, your select board members, all of them except Cambridge and Boston are part-time. Most of them are unpaid. So you really have limited capacity. I, for example, don't have a staff person. If there's something I want to research for Newton, I don't have anyone I can ask to go look it up. So you really don't. So when you have things that are complicated or sciencey, as we're talking about here, or with clean energy, it's a real barrier. And so having local folks such as you all decide to step up and be helpful can be huge. There are things that I've done in Newton because people stepped up and said, oh, Emily, I can go research this, I can write this ordinance, I can go do this. And I'm like, great, that's a wonderful partnership. So in terms of specific steps, now we're going to get in the nitty gritty, and some of this stuff might seem complicated and might seem boring, but if anyone could master municipal aggregation, building codes, or retail net metering of solar, you can master this. I find this way less boring. So if your community has a climate plan or a vulnerability plan, you may have heard of the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. It's a program that Governor Baker has to offer funding to cities and towns to invest in climate resilience. read the plan. If your community doesn't have one, that would be an easy start, but read through it. Does it deal with flooding? Does it deal with drought? Does it deal with heat? Does it address equity? Does it recommend nature-based solutions? If not, talk to your local officials and ask them why, and offer to be helpful in building those in and bringing us in to be helpful. If your community does not have a dedicated person focusing on sustainability, that's a huge barrier. Smaller towns maybe could even share one, but that is something to push for. And I know that pushing for anything that costs more would be a challenge in any environment, but certainly the current one we're in now. But I feel strongly that we do need to walk and chew gum. The pandemic is going on, but climate change also continues. So it's important to continue to advocate. Julian mentioned before as part of our toolkit for solutions, a local wetlands bylaw. So there's a state law that protects wetlands, but it's very baseline, and it doesn't even reference climate change. So there are things you can do in your own community to pass your own bylaw that goes above and beyond the state protection. And we are happy to be helpful with that. I won't go into detail on these. These are some, you'll have access to these slides later so that you can spend more time with them. But just keep in mind, we have only Arlington, talking about the Charles River watershed communities, only Arlington and Boston even reference climate change. So many of them were passed when this was not something that was on anyone's radar. Want to give a shout out to our ally organization, the Massachusetts Association of Conservation Commissions, and I saw that someone from MACC is on the webinar tonight. They're a great resource, particularly for those outside our watershed that we would not have any knowledge about what they have. Want to really give a shout out to Boston, who just passed a new wetlands ordinance, and we worked very closely with them. This is Pam Harvey, our incredible volunteer who worked with us. Michelle Wu was really a real leader in that. City Councilor Michelle Wu as well as Matt O'Malley. So it was exciting to go to the signing of that. Now they're writing the regs that will go along with that, and we are deeply involved in that, but it's a nice success story. Another example of things that can be done, where more can be done, is protecting our trees. And while there are many communities that do have tree protection ordinances, they don't necessarily go as far as they could. So here are some recommendations as well. We also have a pretty comprehensive spreadsheet of examples of things that one could include. So again, anyone who wants to work on this in their own community, please reach out to us. We are happy to work with you. Cambridge has a very strong, probably the strongest tree protection ordinance. And here's something that I asked for recently that you all might think about in your own communities. I asked for an overlay of Newton's tree canopy versus our heat island map. So in an era of limited resources, when you think about, well, where should we focus on protecting trees or planting more trees? Where you have heat island, that is a natural area, so to speak, to invest in more tree canopy. Another example, and Julie had referenced this a little bit earlier, stormwater bylaws. I will be honest with you, before taking this position, taking this job at CRWA, had never heard of stormwater bylaws. So this is, I think, a niche interest, unless you were already working in it, but it's incredibly, incredibly important. While stormwater overall is regulated by the Clean Water Act at the federal level, there's much that states and local communities can do. And so we have some models to help people with that. Originally, stormwater regulations were about pollution and stormwater pollution. But again, there's this wonderful match where what you do to protect against pollution can also help build climate resilience. So we have some recommendations here I won't go into, but these will be available to you. We'd also love to work with you on this. Needham has a stormwater bylaw that we would recommend looking to as an example. Stormwater utility. This was also mentioned earlier on that toolkit slide. It's a lot easier to do things when you have a way to pay for them. And the wonderful thing about a stormwater utility is it's basically a fee for service. The way that you pay for water, you pay for wastewater, you pay for trash. We should be paying for stormwater management. So it doesn't mean that it's more pressure on the general funds because it's a dedicated source of revenue. So particularly now with everything going on and municipal budgets being hammered, it's nice to have this, this dedicated source to make these investments. So I would strongly recommend communities that don't have one, look into having one. And again, we would be happy to work with you. There are several communities, I think it's close to 20 in Massachusetts, that do have stormwater utilities. when there's new development proposed. So I have a lot of examples from Newton because I'm so familiar with it. Maybe you don't have much development proposed in your town, but if you do, that is an obvious opportunity to require developers or to ask them / require them to go above and beyond. And so we've got some examples here of things to ask for. Make sure that they show that they're not going to make flooding worse for their neighbors. Make sure that they're preparing for a 500-year flood because it's not every 500 years anymore. Require nature-based solutions. And again, we are happy to help you with these things. I know this has the word permit in it, which sounds super boring. I'm not going to go super into what the MS4 permit is. In general, it is a mandate on every city and town in the Charles River watershed. It's relatively new. We fought for it we fought to have it and then for it to be stronger. It's a mandate on cities and towns related to phosphorus pollution. But again, the things that communities have to do are also things that will help build climate resilience. I guarantee if you could be asking for your community to be moving faster in complying with this, and that would be really helpful. And we're happy, again, to work with you on that. We haven't talked about the state level. This really was targeted for things you could do in your own community. When it comes to the state, they're already doing some things with the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program that's offering some funding to cities and towns. Again, it would be nice to have a dedicated source of funding. Governor Baker, to his credit, has filed a bill that would offer that with a transfer fee on real estate transactions. This was pre-COVID, so hard to imagine that that would pass right now. But it remains true that there needs to be a dedicated source of funding for these type of investments. Speaker DeLeo also had a bill related to climate resilience and investment. So anyone who wants to advocate at the state level, there are some options there. And I'm just going to end with just a reminder, this is a photo I took at Cutler Park in Boston, where I've been trying to escape every weekend, usually with my kids, although sometimes I want to escape from my kids, to just get out in nature. And I know I'm not the only one. The things that we're proposing are not just good for protecting public health and property, especially our most vulnerable. They're also good for mental health. And I love this article there's hundreds of articles showing the value of nature to our health, but including our mental health, that doctors are issuing nature prescriptions to help treat heart disease, hypertension, high cholesterol, and diabetes. That's how valuable access to nature is. And that's what we're talking about, is increasing access to nature. The solutions we're talking about, particularly in urban environments that lack it, will be so helpful for those who live there. That is it for our presentation. We are here to help. This is our crew of mighty women. We are all women, but it's completely by accident. I want to call out that our program associate, Shayla Porter, is the person to contact if you want to get more involved and take some more action in your community that we can support you on. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to the Q&A. So this was nice to see all the communities. We have Norwood, Boston, Newton, Santa Barbara, California. Yeah, I don't know what watershed that is. Boston, Watertown, Holliston, Brookline, Weston. Reverend Walker, we're also going to have the slides available on our website. So anyone who didn't catch that will be able to get it there. Okay, I do see a question. Can someone address low impact development bylaws? Julie, you want to tackle that?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So low impact development is just a term for developing a way that reduces the impact on the environment as much as possible. And this is, it's not new, but just historically the way we've developed hasn't always taken this into account. And so a lot of cities and towns will have sort of the opposite, like they'll have zoning requirements that actually require a certain amount of parking for each type of business, which of course means more impervious cover. And so low impact development bylaws, or just assessing all your other bylaws for low impact development barriers or encouraging low impact development, is a great approach and an important thing for local communities to do. And actually, there is a program that Mass Audubon has called Shaping the Future of Our Communities, where they have a toolkit there on their website, the Shaping the Future of Their Communities website, where they have a toolkit to actually help communities do that. Look at their existing bylaws to see if they're actually creating barriers to low impact development, and then also making recommendations for what you can do to build more low impact development requirements into local regulations.
Awesome, thank you, Julie. Kanan asks, what does the passing of local wetland ordinances mean to current and new developments?
I can take that one as well. So that will mean different requirements at the local level for new developments. So depending on exactly what the requirements are in your wetlands bylaw, it may mean that they have to avoid certain areas. So one thing you can do in your wetlands bylaw is define what's called your resource area. So some of those are defined at the state level, but you can further define them and protect some additional areas at the local level. So maybe you want to keep your developments a little bit further away from wetlands than would be okay at the state level. So you can do that. You can also require, certain what we call performance metrics. So you can request that they, for example, look at large storm events. So as Emily mentioned, in Arlington and Boston, where they specifically mention climate change in these local ordinances and bylaws, they're asking that developers that come in front of the Conservation Commission show that they can plan for larger flood events. And so it gives some authority to that local Conservation Commission to actually address that and ask those questions and understand, for example, what future scenario flood impacts will be. So as opposed to just looking at a backward-looking rainfall pattern, they can actually ask that developers look at forward-looking, possible flood impacts. And there's lots of other things. We do have some strong recommendations. And again, as Emily mentioned, a lot of good stuff from MACC on wetlands bylaws and what you can do to strengthen your local one.
Awesome, thank you, Julie. So Nasser asked an excellent question that I face quite a bit in Newton. You recommended avoiding development in wetlands and other wooded areas. There is also a housing affordability crisis and a lot of anti-development local pressure in areas of existing development where density could be accommodated. What do you do as an organization to find solutions to these trade-offs and conflicts in interests? So that's not something that CRWA has gotten too involved with. I certainly deal with that as a city councilor. But what we have done is where there are large developments, really anywhere, but particularly there's quite a few right near the Charles River right now. So that one, the Riverside project that I showed is a current one that's being negotiated now. We do weigh in with what we think the right thing to do is to reduce phosphorus pollution, to reduce flooding, to be protecting against the precipitation of the future rather than the precipitation of the past. And that's a huge development. So, so that's something that will offer a lot of new housing units, and there are quite a few. I know much more about Newton since I serve as a local elected there, so I can't speak as much to other communities, but certainly when you have more density, and so you're not taking natural cover, but you're providing more density in areas that are already developed. That's something to do. Another thing that we're facing in Newton and maybe elsewhere is that there's a lot of pressure to take smaller homes down and replace them with really large ones. So it doesn't really necessarily help with affordability, but it's something that people, they want to make more money with their property. But it does mean where you have a large yard, for example, that you're covering up with more impermeable surface. So it is a concern that I've had sort of, well, I think maybe it might make more sense to really focus on the areas that are already built up and really, expand them rather than take more and more and more natural cover and replace it with impermeable, particularly when you have an area that's already quite built out, because we're going to be pushing off the problem further and further, and we're really not preparing for the precipitation that's coming. Another example, which is sort of current, that wasn't what you were asking, but something I think folks should be thinking about, is if you remember that slide I showed of Newton's historical wetlands and streams and brooks, a lot of them have municipal buildings on them now, because that was the last land, it was the least attractive, so it was the last to be developed. And this is not just Newton, it's true in a lot of communities. So you might be replacing a municipal building or a school. What we were able to get away with in terms of putting a building on a wetland may not be so feasible in the future. We may need to be thinking about putting buildings on stilts. So I really would encourage all of us to also be thinking about resilience in our public sector buildings and buildings that we are investing in, that a lot of folks aren't really necessarily thinking about that. Kanan asks, why aren't micro units a thing yet? Isn't that how we can meet the housing demands while also reducing emissions in the present and the future, while also reducing people's utility expenses? I'm 100% with you. It's funny growing up in this area and knowing back in the day, there used to be not that uncommon to have homes of 6 children, 10 children, a dozen children crammed into the homes that are existing now. We were used to living with less space per person. I know that it's a thing in Boston, the micro units. I've seen it less. I've even personally, sort of with my city councilor hat on, I've proposed it for developers in Newton, and they haven't really jumped on it. So I do think that's something that we should be looking at. So maybe that will come. Hello, Reverend, welcome back. We're just going through the questions here. All right, here's another question. Well, here's a shout out to my predecessor, Rita Barron from Stan. Thank you for an informative webinar. I'm delighted to see that Rita Barron's legacy is still being fulfilled. Absolutely, she was a force of nature, so to speak. So I'm excited to be doing whatever I can to carry on her legacy. From Christine, how have you addressed the challenge of getting buy-in from the numerous municipalities and stakeholders along the watershed? How extensive is grassroots activism in these cities and towns? Reverend Walker, you want to tackle that one?
Well, there is an interest. Before the coronavirus, I was traveling to different parts of the state, meeting with different people. So there seemed to be an interest across the state. But obviously Rome wasn't built overnight, and there's still a lot more people who were trying to expose more to climate resiliency.
So part of my passion for doing this is that I've seen the power in local grassroots activism on the clean energy side, and there just hasn't been really the similar on the resilience side, and I do attribute it to sort of lack of knowledge necessary of what even to advocate for, because, I mean, as you could probably tell from the presentation, a lot of this is super science-y. A lot of people are not hydrologists, and this isn't intuitive. So we do hope that we are sparking a revolution in grassroots organizing around climate resilience. And so would welcome your help. Lori asks, are any groups working on climate change and limiting population growth? Continuous growth is not sustainable. Well, I'll answer that. I think that's outside, the scale of what we're talking, or the scope of what we're talking about here. But from everything I've seen, educating girls and educating women around the world has so many benefits, population, good decision making. So that's what I have seen in terms of what's considered the best practice, is educating girls around the country and the world. Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Oh, I was just going to add something to your to some of the questions we got about the seeming conflicts with development versus natural spaces. And so I think, you know, Emily mentioned a lot of good strategies. Density, we talked about low impact development. So there are, you know, ways of developing that are better versus others. Just the other comment I wanted to throw in on that is that right now it can be a lot cheaper for developing in green spaces versus maybe, you know, developing in an old building or, you know, doing what's called infill development, developing an area that's already infilled or that's already been developed in the past. And the problem with that scenario is that it doesn't put a proper value on the resources that the green spaces are providing us. So while it's cheaper, kind of what is the cost to the community surrounding? So I think that should just be a part of the conversation too, that yes, we really, really need housing for our social good and our sustainable economy and, you know, to keep our area growing the way it has been. And that's great. But we should just be thoughtful about where we're doing it and how we're doing it. And just kind of take a big picture view of all the social goods that kind of play in there. Because that infrastructure, you know, that natural space that's there is providing some services that we're not always valuing.
Let's see, another one from Lori. Do you see communities offering incentives to limit growth? I guess growth, well, I guess that's sort of what we've been talking about, which is what sort of policies would limit growth in areas that would make life more dangerous for everyone who's already there. I don't know, Julie, if you have another way to respond to that.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, yeah, sometimes you do see that, you know, you do see the towns that don't want, you know, that really don't want new development, that want to keep, you know, obviously, you know, the communities that I showed that have less than 6% impervious cover, that's taken some work to keep the development out. So yes, sometimes you do see that. For most of the communities, though, it is about where you develop and how you develop. And, you know, just to reiterate, it's not great to develop somewhere that's going to become dangerous. You know, you don't want housing in an area where it's going to flood soon. And you don't want, you know, to develop in a way that's going to make life more dangerous to others.
Let's see, another question from Christine. Economist, or I guess a comment, an economist determined the value of a live whale, which made advocating for policies that protected whales easier. Perhaps a similar study could be done on undeveloped wetlands. Moving it from science to dollars could help people understand.
Yeah, there's been a bunch of studies on the economic service value and value of wetlands. Doesn't always come into every local decision, I guess.
But yeah, similarly, as on the energy side, we're trying to put a price on carbon pollution. If we could be putting a price on the value of the clean air, less flooding, etc. And there is a value, there's an interesting report on the value of the Charles River Natural Valley storage area that has saved tens of millions of dollars every year in reduced flooding. So anytime, I think Christine makes a great point, anytime you can put a money value on things, it certainly helps with your advocacy. It is almost 8:30 and we like to end on time. So thank you all so much for participating, and thank you, Reverend Walker, if you're still there. It's good to see you walking around, for joining us tonight. And
I'm still here. I'm still here.
Oh, you are? Okay, great. I'm just closing it out. The slides are going to be available and the recording will be available. And we hope to be able to, oh, you know what, Nasser, I saw your last question. I'll follow up with you. And look forward to hearing from folks and hopefully working with you to get these policies moved forward in the future. So thank you all so much.